Thank you. I'm really grateful to be invited to speak here. It's great to have this opportunity to talk to you. I feel very honoured to be invited. I feel a bit of an imposter after what we've just heard, but hey, I'll do my best. I want to think a bit about primary schools, and I want to kind of zoom out from the specifics of gender identity theory to what does feminism teach us about primary schools as contexts in which education about sex and gender happens. And I work in teacher education now, so I go into a lot of schools, a lot of primary schools, and I know what I'm going to see when I arrive there. If I arrive at a break time or a play time, which I quite often do, I'm going to see what I've been seeing since I started my own teacher training back in the 1980s. I'm going to see the central space of the playground mostly taken up by boys, mostly playing football, and the girls will mostly be walking and talking around the edges, maybe doing some dance moves, maybe skipping games, but they'll be taking up a peripheral space. And occasionally something different will be happening, but it's vanishingly rare to see a radically different pattern, to see equal use of the playground by children of both sexes. And when I go into classrooms, I'm equally certain about what I'm going to see. So girls will be far more likely to be quietly getting on with their work, doing as they're told the first time, keeping their belongings neat and tidy. And the children who are out of their seats, who are making a noise, taking a long time to settle to their work, needing lots of reminders to get on, they're much more likely to be boys. Now, of course, there are individual differences, and I'm certainly not saying there are no obstreperous girls or no gentle, studious boys, because of course there are. But the overall pattern is almost always the same. Girls are the civilizing influence in the classroom, boys are requiring girls to civilize them. And because boys' behavior is almost always more difficult for teachers to manage, the teachers will spend much more time listening to boys, asking them questions, working with them and so on. And that's completely normalized. So one thing I sometimes do is a little tally graph in a class. If the teacher's teaching from the front, I keep a tag of how many times they ask boys to contribute and how many times they ask girls. And it's almost always very, very heavily weighted in favor of boys. But when I tell teachers that, they're horrified because they've had no idea they were doing it. And when they then monitor themselves and self-consciously go girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, their perception is that they're hugely favouring girls, and the children think the same, because we're all so used to male domination of space. So in other words, girls are learning at a really young age, I'm talking very young children here, from the age of 5, but children are learning that boys' domination of airtime, of talking time, is normal, unremarkable, part of the natural order of things. It's just what happens. And as children move through the primary school years, their peer groups become increasingly important to them, to how they understand themselves, how they relate to the world around them. Girls and boys gain status differently in the peer group. So for girls, being capable, being sensible, being a kind and caring friend, or at least one who understands emotional dynamics in friendships, being physically attractive, those are the things that tend to gain status. And of course, to caveat, there are other structural indices of difference that always shape that. So social class will make a difference, race will make a difference. In Scotland, urban, rural will make a difference. But in general, it's a pattern that we're likely to see. So for boys, gaining status tends to be associated with being good at physical games, good at sport, particularly football, and for being argumentative, especially with the teacher. So some children, of course, go against the grain, but that has costs, and probably the children for whom it has most costs are the gentle, studious boys who are right at the bottom of the pecking order. And we need to think about that when we're thinking about how we respond to children's gender nonconformity, not going along with the expectations. And I think this really matters for how schools teach sex and relationships education. Because if everything about the environment of the primary school teaches them that there are these gendered expectations and that those expectations are becoming settled into habits that become normal and natural and go unremarked, then a few lessons on unsettling gender stereotypes, which we have in the Scottish curriculum, and the occasional exhortation that, of course, girls can play football and boys can play princesses, which also is in the Scottish curriculum, but those lessons parachuted into daily experience that pigeonhole children and box them in different ways are going to have very little effect at all. So what I suggest we need to think about is this question. How can schools be places where it's not just okay to go against the grain of gendered expectations, but it's actually satisfying and rewarding and high status to be an assertive, physically active girl, and it's satisfying and rewarding and high status to be a gentle, studious boy? Now, I don't know how we do that. That's a difficult question. But I do know that positioning children who are going against the grain as possibly the other sex isn't the way to do it. So if we do think hard about how to do that as a school, then your teaching about sex and gender, your relationships and sex education, it lands differently. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But before I do that, I want to go back to what's feminist about this. So I'm working here with an established feminist understanding of gender, which is that it's a social structure, a bit like Tamazin was saying. It's a set of norms and expectations that shape how children come to learn and understand who they are and how they can act in the world. And it holds in place an overall pattern of male dominance, the sexism that Tamazin was talking about. I'm going to read you a quotation that comes from Connell and Pearce. And they say, "Gender is multidimensional. It's not just about identity or just about work or just about power or just about sexuality, but about all of these things at once. And although children in primary school aren't going to understand those things necessarily, we as teachers, educators need to be scaffolding environments in which that we understand them and in which we can challenge them." And as countless feminist scholars and teachers have said, schools are places where children's developing sense of themselves is profoundly shaped by gender as a social structure. And I'm by no means saying here, I'm by no means arguing for the notion of an innate gender identity that somehow prefigures children's speech and acts. But what I am saying is that the gendered environment of the school can have a deep and enduring effect on children's sense of who they are. And there's loads of feminist studies about how this happens. From about the 1990s, an American researcher called Barry Thorne published a really interesting study of children in primary school classrooms called Gender Play. And there have been lots and lots of studies since. I can give references afterwards to anyone who's interested in. One that I read recently, which took place in London, was a researcher who coined this term boy-splaining for what she was seeing going on in a classroom. And it's a really evocative term, and I could understand what it was immediately. But here's what she says about it, and it's the quotation that's on the screen. She says, "Boys interrupted, explained things excessively or condescendingly, ignored and explicitly shamed other students in the learning environment. And this behaviour, repeated constantly, defended diligently, requires that boys position themselves in opposition to those against whom it's directed, and ultimately reinforces the subordination of girls in the classroom." So boys' domination and girls' subordination, it doesn't just derive from out there. It's in the way that children act and behave and learn that they're supposed to act and behave in classrooms and repeat on that daily ingrained basis, such that nobody notices it because it's become natural. And when things are natural and normal and unremarkable, we can't think about them, we can't interrogate them, we can't notice them, let alone challenge them. So Scotland we have to call everything differently in Scotland. We call ours the relationships, sexual health and parenthood curriculum, and it's actually quite good. It's a good curriculum, it's got some helpful guidance. The guidance includes material on challenging gender stereotypes at all levels. So there's a nice little activity, a kind of question, who can play with what. It addresses lots of things that feminists would want to see in a curriculum, so same-sex attraction, bodily privacy, and so on. It's fine. So in the supporting materials for lower primary, there's a lesson on addressing stereotypes. And I'll read you. The Scottish curriculum is organised around I can, things it wants children to be able to do. So for this lesson on addressing gender stereotypes, it says, I can, this is young children, infant age, 4, 5, 6, 7, I can understand that how I look, how I behave, or my aspirations should not be limited by stereotypes, my sex, or expectations of what boys and girls should do in a lesson, in a single lesson. But of course, if I want children to understand those things. I think it's really important, but they're not going to learn it in a single lesson unless the context around them is really supporting them to keep asking those questions, to keep examining what they're doing. So that lesson is supported by a nice PowerPoint. It's got pictures of girls and boys playing with blocks, girls and boys playing with football, girls and boys colouring in the home corner, and it's fine. But if it lands in a school context where girls are disproportionately quiet and kind and compliant, and boys are disproportionately loud and obstreperous and aggressive, and day-to-day practices like the boy-splaining on the earlier slide are normal and unremarkable, then it's not likely to have very much effect, certainly not the effect that's intended. So, if we want to think about a feminist approach to teaching sex and gender in schools and a feminist RSHP curriculum or RSE curriculum, depending on which nation you're in, I think we need to think of it as being nested in a school context that pays attention to these habitual gendered practices and tries to notice and unravel them. So I'm coming to the end of the time here, and I can't go into these in detail. So they're really things to think about, because they're hard things. Gender is very, very ingrained, and we need to think hard about how to disentangle it from all the daily practices in which it's embedded. But what I'm suggesting here is taking, in a primary school, children's existing behaviour and choices as a starting point, and exploring with them how that behaviour and how those choices have been shaped, rather than taking them as natural and inevitable. So you might want to ask a teacher to monitor the kind of tally graph that I was talking about, teachers doing that themselves and then talking to children about what they find. And certainly when they're alternating between girls and boys, if the children perceive that as favouring the girls, having a conversation about why that is. Enlisting children themselves in doing that investigating. Send children, I'm talking about middle primary now, can do this quite successfully, children of 8 or 9. Send them out on the playground to monitor the use of playground space, who's doing what, how are friendships across the sexes, if they happen at all, or games across the sexes, how are those facilitated. Children have an innate sense of fairness. And when you ask them to participate in activities like this, that taps into that sense of fairness and can get them thinking critically. So if I go back to my question slide, I don't know how to go back. Yes, woo, I've gone back. Hooray. So that question that I was asking, how can schools create conditions in which it's okay and enjoyable for girls and boys to go against the grain? You can see already, if your school environment is asking that question, then I haven't talked about gender identity, but ideas about if you're not comfortable, if you're a gentle, studious boy, or if you're a physically obstreperous girl, are you of the opposite sex? Those land very, very differently. You can have very different kinds of conversations. So what I'm suggesting is that schools, before gender identity theory hit, were not places of gender and sex, milk and honey. They really weren't. And I think taking a step back and thinking about how schools are shaped and how schools shape children as context, and having a willingness to interrogate gender itself and to encourage children to be inquisitive about gendered practices in school, I think that might help us to come to a way forward in the current contexts in which we find ourselves. Thanks very much.